Hey CW Bio, Mr. Kennedy here, and these are your Chapter 5 lecture notes in video form on population ecology. We're going to take a look at everything there is to know about population ecology and how it works, how populations will ebb and flow, grow or decline, and even look at human populations by the time this is all said and done. So the first thing that we need to do if we're going to talk population ecology is to review what a population is. Population is a group of organisms, all the same species, that live in a specific area all at the same time. Healthy populations should grow and die at steady rates unless something bad happens, like you run out of food or space, or they're attacked in some way by disease or predators. And scientists study these populations so that we can determine the health of the ecosystem. There's a couple of different ways that we can study it. One method involves introducing organisms into an environment that contains abundant resources and basically sitting back and watching to see how they react. This is something that we could pull off if maybe we have a small organism, inconspicuous organism, definitely something that was not a vertebrate, like plants or bacteria. Higher organisms, vertebrates of all varieties, well, if you were to do this to them, it would be considered unethical and not allowed. So how do we study larger organisms? Well, if you're going to study something that has a backbone, a vertebrate like elk, then you're going to have to use like radio monitors or some other type of sampling that doesn't actually hurt the animal in the end to watch how their population adapts and adjusts and deals with environmental conditions. Next thing we're going to look at is how do populations grow? So when you think about population growth, I want you to think about two terms, linear growth and exponential growth. Linear growth is growth that is very similar to what you might experience later in life when you get a job and you start earning a paycheck. When you start earning a paycheck, you're probably going to start off at minimum wage and have to work for a company for 6 months or a year before you even see a small raise. You might have to then work another year before you get another raise. And if you were to plot that on graph paper, well, you'd probably end up with a pretty flat, straight line. Nature doesn't grow that way, okay? There's no guaranteed year after year that X number of individuals are going to be added to a population. In nature, we don't see linear growth. We see growth that experiences a little bit of a lag phase, followed by exponential growth, and then some sort of cap later on. So let's talk about those pieces. When you graph natural growth, you end up looking at something that looks like the letter J. So here we have a population of houseflies, and they've experienced a time period in their history where, let's just say, life was pretty hard. Births basically equaled deaths. You can liken this in human history to a period in our history prior to the Industrial Revolution. There was no modern medicine, running water, or even flush toilets for that matter. So yeah, births roughly equaled deaths. People didn't live very long. After the Industrial Revolution, life got better. There was modern medicine, running water, and yes, flush toilets. So more people were living longer, people were having more children, and more children were surviving to reproduce themselves. That caused this portion of the graph, this steep curve, right? And the idea in this exponential growth is that your population is going to grow faster and at larger rates. So if you think about it in terms of drawing a paycheck, instead of getting a dollar raise after a year and then waiting another year for another dollar, you're going to get a dollar raise after your first year. Then 6 months later, you're going to get like $2 raise. And then like 3 months later, it's going to be like a $4 raise. Do you see what's happening? The period between raises is getting smaller and the size of the raise is getting bigger. So that's faster and faster growth. So the initial increase in the number of organisms, or in your pay, might be really, really slow because the number of reproducing individuals is really small. Soon, however, the rate of population growth increases because something positive has happened in the environment, allowing the total number of reproducing individuals to also increase. With more reproductively capable individuals, the population will definitely grow faster, leading to that J-shaped curve, or as I said, exponential growth. Exponential growth, again, means that as the population gets bigger, it's going to grow at a faster and faster rate. Now, The graph that I showed you before with the J shape to it implies that exponential growth, well, basically has no ceiling. That's not true. We can't have any population, humans included, continue to grow exponentially forever. When you think about what puts a ceiling on exponential growth, we need to introduce a new term, and that term is the limiting factor. Limiting factors such as the availability of food, disease, predators, lack of space, the list could go on and on and on, will flatten the top end of a J-shaped curve. Basically, when a population is put under food pressure, they're not going to have lots of offspring, or if they do have offspring, those offspring won't survive. So the J-shaped graph starts to flatten out and look more S-shaped. This is an S-shaped growth curve, or basically a J-shaped curve that is being influenced by limiting factors, and it flattens out. And you can see that births at the top end of the graph roughly equal deaths. Now, I don't want you to think this is all doom and gloom. This does not mean or spell the end of a population. What this does is slow growth, but under the influence of limiting factors, populations can persist at this state literally indefinitely. This flat line in the graph is referred to as carrying capacity. It's the maximum number of individuals that the environment can support. Look at that word, indefinitely. It doesn't say for a short time and then they go extinct. It says indefinitely. So in a healthy ecosystem, believe it or not, all populations actually exist at or very near a carrying capacity all the time. The other thing that you need to think about carrying capacity is that lower life forms, and I'll probably throw humans in on this one, they're not real smart when it comes to carrying capacity. Like they can't predict exactly how big can my population get before I hit carrying capacity. They just keep reproducing and hope for the best. And unfortunately, at some point or another, nature will let you know once you've hit carrying capacity, because all those limiting factors will kick in and growth will slow. When you think about reproduction at that rate, well, most populations will overshoot carrying capacity repeatedly. If it was something like a human and we overshot carrying capacity, we can learn from our mistakes, but lower life forms cannot. When it comes springtime, it's just time to start, reproducing. So if you look at carrying capacity through a little bit more accurate lens than the graph I showed you before, this is what carrying capacity really looks like. It's kind of a boom-bust mentality here, where a population will reproduce, make more individuals than actually the environment can support. Something bad happens, drives that number down below carrying capacity, and then in the subsequent seasons, they work their way right back up. Now, of course, if something dramatic happened, like, famine, a severe drought that goes on for years and years that leads to that famine, well, then you could drop that line significantly below carrying capacity. But if it's a healthy ecosystem with good biodiversity, the individuals will work their way back and not just go extinct. Next thing we want to look at in terms of population growth is a population's reproduction patterns. In nature, we know that animal and plant populations change in size. The way they change in size is sometimes referred to as their life history pattern or their reproductive pattern. And there's two reproductive patterns that I really want you to focus on in this chapter: a rapid life history pattern and a slow life history pattern. The rapid life history patterns are common amongst organisms from highly variable, highly changeable, highly unpredictable environments. The idea here is that, well, the only way you can survive all this environmental fluctuation is to reproduce faster than nature can kill you off. So in rapid life history patterns, organisms usually have small body sizes, they mature rapidly, reproduce early, and have a really short lifespan. Think about bacteria as a great case in point. The opposite of this is a slow life history pattern. Slow life history patterns are those that are employed by large species that live in very stable and slowly changing environments. The reason that a slow life history pattern is favored in these cases is because organisms that are in stable environments, well, they'll reproduce at a slow rate, they'll mature at a slow rate, and they'll live a really long time. So if you had a slow life history pattern, but you were living in an unpredictable environment, honestly, all your young would die and you wouldn't be able to reproduce fast enough to replace them. That's not good. You'd go extinct. So the only way slow life history patterned animals can survive is if the environment is relatively stable. Okay, next thing we're going to look at is an organism's distribution and factors that influence its distribution. When you think about distribution in nature, there's three patterns that we usually see: random, clumped, and uniform. And these three patterns are almost always, well, directly connected to resource availability. If resources are plentiful, no real pressure, it's not real hard to find, then you'll probably find a random distribution in the organisms living in a particular area. Because it really doesn't matter where you live, you can find what you need. If those organisms are territorial, like, they have their own little territory or space that they want to protect, then you'll probably find a uniform distribution. When resources become scarce, that's when you start to see clumped distributions. Look at the map of the United States. Have you ever wondered why towns are located where they are or cities located where they are? In almost every case, if you look close enough at the map, one of the, number one resources that dictates where we put communities is water. So there's probably a body of water very nearby. And since water is a vital resource and scarce in many parts of the country, that's why those towns are there. When you think about other factors that might influence your dispersion in nature besides water, we've got to talk about two big categories of factors that control how you might be distributed. They're called density dependent and density independent factors. Population density just describes the number of individuals that can fit in a given area. So how many individuals fit in an area here is going to be connected to these factors and then to random, clumped, and uniform distributions. When you think about density-dependent factors, these are factors that influence populations differently depending upon the size the population gets. So the bigger the population, the more pressure these put on it. Think about disease, competition, food, all that. The bigger the population is, the more we're going to fight for things like food. Okay? Density-independent factors are the exact opposite. They have the same impact no matter how big the population is. Doesn't matter if you have 2 individuals or 2 million individuals. If it's 110 degrees outside, I hate to tell you this, but everybody's going to be hot, right? Doesn't matter how many individuals are there. All right, next thing to consider is the fact that, aside from all these abiotic things, sometimes organisms, they just don't get along well with other organisms. Or maybe one organism eats another organism. So aside from abiotic factors, other biotic factors can limit the size a population can get. Probably the easiest thing to discuss when we talk about organisms interacting and controlling each other's populations is the predator-prey relationship. I know you probably are well versed in what this is, where one animal eats another one, right? When a predator consumes prey on a large enough scale, believe it, it can have a drastic effect on the size of the prey population and, a domino effect on the predator population. Think of it this way. If the prey population is high, the predator population will grow to meet it. As the predator population gets really big and they feast on prey, the prey population falls and the predator population will follow that too. Here's a classic example. This is a classic example that's in every book I've ever read that talks about this stuff. Looking at the Canadian lynx and the snowshoe hare. And just look at those two red and blue lines, right? And you can easily see the direct connection between the predator population and its fluctuations up and down, and then the prey population and its fluctuations up and down. In field studies, predation increases the chances that resources will actually be available for the remaining individual prey population. So, on one hand, I suppose having predators around is good for prey. You can also have competition within a population. Okay? Remember, competition is a density-dependent factor. And at this point, we're not talking about like, a lion eating a gazelle or a lynx eating a hare. We're talking about individuals within the same population just fighting for like space, mates, or food. When only a few individuals compete for resources, there's really no problem. But when a population increases to the point at which demand for resources exceeds supply, there's gonna be a fight. When populations of certain organisms become crowded, individuals can exhibit stress, populations can increase in size, and the environment then can't support the increased numbers. Individual animals can exhibit a variety of stress symptoms. Those can include aggression, decreased parental care, decreased fertility, decreased resistance to disease. All of these can become limiting factors for growth and keep populations at or below carrying capacity. All right, ladies and gents, that's part one of population ecology. When I come back, we're going to talk about people. I'm Mr. Kennedy, and I'll see you in a minute.